So channel 4 is Spanish. Hello and welcome. I hope interpretation is working. So just once again, for those who are present here in the room, we do have interpretation in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. For those following the event back home, you will only be able to hear the floor language, which mostly will be in English. We have asked our indigenous friends from Brazil to open this event in a good manner, as Graham usually say, and this will be in Portuguese. So for those who do not understand Portuguese, make sure to have an equipment. And if I can invite our friends from Brazil to come up here. Thanks.
Bom dia. Esse canto é um canto de criança e é, na verdade, um canto de uma criança falando para o seu sagrado, na minha língua, meu povo. E eu escolhi porque nós precisamos ter a essência da criança e ouvir os nossos sagrados. Posso começar? Aloha, aloha, awataba, itegunisa, xili, 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 xili. Aloha, aloha, awataba, itegunisa, xili, 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 xili. Ido, aquele, tiduase. Alês.
Thank you so much to our friends from Brazil. We're looking forward to the COP in a couple of years from now, which we hear will be hosted in your lands. Great. So let's get started. Climate change is a matter of life and death. These were the first words that Indigenous peoples voiced at COP27 in their opening statement. And we all know this is to be true. And so we also know that the world's governments back in 2015 agreed a plan to address and reverse the climate crisis. And this year is time to take stock of progress under the Paris Agreement, or perhaps lack of the same. This process is known as the Global Stocktake, and Indigenous peoples have a lot to contribute to this. Gideon, I can't see you. Before introducing you and the rest of the panel, could I just ask you briefly to explain why it is that that Indigenous peoples have a lot to contribute. Thanks. And also in terms of the relevance of knowledge systems and the protection of lands, just in 30 seconds perhaps.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stefan. Indigenous people knowledge system are key to understand the colonial root causes behind the climate crisis, the climate challenges that are facing our planets today. And many people might not be aware that Indigenous people, while constituting just 6% of the world populations, protect more than 28% of the global land surface, including vital biodiversity and carbon sink. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very brief and precise. Thanks, Gideon. And indeed, you're right that all over the world we know of Indigenous activists defending their lands and territories from environmentally harming external interference, and they do that with all means possible. Which is also why, unfortunately, Indigenous defenders are overrepresented in global statistics on environmental defenders killed each year. This is one of the reasons why Indigenous peoples have demanded and achieved a special protection under the UN, and more specifically in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I think most of us are familiar with the UN DRIP and how Indigenous peoples enjoy a unique set of collective rights, and that includes rights to lands, territories, and resources, and to self-determination. And core here is the right to free, prior, and informed consent to any activity affecting their lifeways, lands, territories, and resources. So it goes without saying that when it comes to taking stock of how the world is doing with regards to preventing climate collapse, if you want, Indigenous peoples must be recognized for their leadership and authority. And so today we have an inspiring panel of speakers. Adaria of the Selkop Indigenous Peoples of Siberia. She's also a member of the Facilitative Working Group of the platform established under the UNFCCC dedicated to equal representation of Indigenous peoples and state party representatives. And we also have next to her Lakpa Nuri of the Sherpa Indigenous people of Nepal, and Lakpa works for the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, which is the largest regional network of indigenous organizations in Asia, and he's also UNFCCC constituency focal point for the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, also known as the Indigenous Peoples Caucus. And then we have Gideon Sanago from the Maasai Indigenous people of East Africa, Tanzania, and Gideon works for the Pastoralist Indigenous NGO Forum in Tanzania. Then Graham Reed from the Anishinaabe, Indigenous people from the Great Lakes, the Wigwamkong unceded territory, mixed ancestry from England, Scotland, Germany, and Graham works for the Assembly of First Nations, and he's also a member of the Facilitative Working Group. And lastly, in a couple of minutes, we will have Maria Samuelson joining us. Maria is chief negotiator for the Danish delegation, and she'll be giving some insights from, let's say, from a government delegation that is indeed in support of Indigenous peoples advocacy. Her colleague Frode was here at the previous side event on loss and damage, and we also have Lærke in the audience, a colleague who is here to take notes. So that's great to have you here. My name is Stefan Tosel. I'm climate advisor with the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, IWGIA, and on behalf of the group of organizations that organized this event, Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact, Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities, NEFIN, Center for Support of Indigenous Peoples of the North, CSIPN, and Pastoralist Indigenous NGO Forum, Pingos Forum, I'd like to thank you all for being here today. Good. First, Graham, we're going to talk a bit about the Global Stocktake today. And you're leading the group within the Indigenous Peoples Caucus that engages in the Global Stocktake here at SP58. Could you share why the Global Stocktake is taken very seriously by the Indigenous Peoples Caucus? And also, could you perhaps summarize the statement presented by Pratima yesterday on behalf of the caucus, please? Thanks.
Yeah, awesome, Miigwech, and really excited to see everybody here, and really want to acknowledge the organizers, my fellow panelists, and all my Indigenous relations in the crowd. Anim Bojo, Graham Reed, Ditishnikaz, Otto Anunjaba, Anishinaabe, and Dow. Really honored to join this space and to talk about the Global Stocktake. I mean, I think most of you are likely following or are aware of what it is, but you know, in 30 seconds or less, it's the ambition mechanism to reflect on collective progress. And I think this is really important for Indigenous peoples because it is very clear that we aren't doing enough. And it's very clear that, at least based in the conversation that the Indigenous Peoples Caucus has been having, as well as what we heard in the previous panel discussion on loss and damage, that these realities are foundationally changing the way in which Indigenous peoples exercise their relationship with the natural world, with the four-leggeds, the two-leggeds, and the winged ones. The Indigenous Peoples Caucus has been actively participating in this process, and not only with respect to the Global Stocktake broadly, the technical dialogues, the World Cafe, but also the specific items under each of those, mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, financing, and then the interconnected nature of those, key of which is, you know, acknowledging the way in which Indigenous peoples conceptualize and think about, you know, what is the climate problem, the root cause of the climate problem that we're here talking about, and therefore, what are the solutions that Indigenous peoples are looking for? For us, when we conceptualize the root problem, we're really talking about a world out of balance, a world that is disrespecting its original instructions. And so, you know, when conceptualizing it in that way, we can then think about different types of solutions. And so yesterday, we had the opportunity as the Indigenous Peoples Caucus to address the opening plenary. As Stefan indicated, Pratima, who happens to be sitting in the front row and want to acknowledge the delivery of the statement from Pratima, really, I think, articulated what Indigenous peoples have been communicating in this space is first the recognition that we don't need a global stocktake to tell us that we're not doing enough. We feel that every single day on our lands, waters, and territories. But in the opportunity presented in reviewing our collective progress, we really see additional opportunities in strengthening the consideration and protection of Indigenous peoples in all four of those areas that I mentioned: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, finance. And so in our discussion, we picked up on a few different things. The first is really the underlining principle of how Indigenous peoples show up within this space, which is through the safeguarding and protection of our rights. Those rights affirmed within the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a key element of, you know, how we show up, how we engage, and how we reflect on the contributions and responsibilities that Indigenous peoples have within this space. On mitigation, we echoed the statement in our opening statement, which is really a reviewing of the root causes of the climate crisis, that centrality of, real emissions and reducing those emissions at the source. But what I think is equally important is that we don't want the transition to reproduce the same policies of dispossession, of criminalization, and of removal of Indigenous peoples to their lands and territories. And so really we want to avoid the tendency for what I guess I'm characterizing as a green rush, the way in which we're rushing to assert and implement, new energy on lands and territories that are by and large Indigenous lands and territories. And Gideon described that in terms of the percentage of land across the world that is occupied, managed, and in relation to Indigenous peoples. We talked briefly in the context of adaptation about the ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous knowledge systems, the importance of full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples, of youth, of women, of persons with disabilities, all of which are central to understanding these as processes and not as outcomes in themselves. And then finally, of course, the importance of direct access to funding for Indigenous peoples through their appropriate mechanisms, funding to all 7 UN socio-cultural regions. So I'll stop there and say miigwech and give it back to Stefan.
Thank you so much, Graham. Yeah, give us an applause. And we'll come back to you later. So many points you brought up there. And if we had a couple of extra hours, I'd love to come back to also some of the more deeper things around. You mentioned the original instructions. I'm not sure that's not from a UNFCCC document. That's a whole different thing. But man, I would wish that everybody here in Bonn would know about those. But we have to unfortunately to move on. And so I think I'll go to you, Daria. Don't be surprised. So Daria, you're here today representing a bit, if you want, the Facilities Working Group, which is a constituted body under the UNFCCC. And that being a constituted body, I believe, kind of gives some sort of perhaps access and is being listened to in a different way than those who are from the observer side of things. So I'd love to kind of hear, in terms of the Global Stocktake, those key messages and input that are being considered and developed from the FWG, which again I should remind is a body of 7 constituting 7 Indigenous people representatives, 1 from each socio-cultural region, and then 7 state party representatives. Thank you, Daria.
Thank you so much, Stefan. So the Conference of the Party at its 21st session recognized the need to strengthen knowledge, technologies, practices and efforts of local communities and Indigenous people related to addressing and responding to climate change. In this context, the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform was established for the exchange of experience and sharing of best practices of mitigation and adaptation in a holistic and integrated manner. As Stefan mentioned, the Facility Working Group consists of equal representation from parties and Indigenous peoples organizations. The Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform has 3 main functions: knowledge, capacity for engagement, climate action policy and actions. The Conference of the Parties, serving as at the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, established a technical dialogue as part of the first global stocktake of collective progress towards achieving its purpose and long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. The Facility Working Group decided to make their input to the first report, to the first report of the on the global stocktake. The role of indigenous peoples in catalyzing collective progress has been qualified and discussed through several of the meetings and activities under the platform. To achieve the objective of the Paris Agreement and reverse biodiversity, decline the practices and experience with mitigation and adaptation of indigenous peoples and local communities can provide concrete example of effective action to help reorient how society interacts with nature. Indigenous peoples have distinct knowledge system in part through generation of relation with their environmental. In relation to the overall effect of and progress towards nationally determined contribution and to the state of adaptation efforts, indigenous peoples and local communities have significant potential to contribute to the development and implementation of DC and NAPs, and work under the LCIPP has contributed to the collection of insights and experience relevant to both mitigation and adaptation. Mapping of existing policies, action and communication under the Convention indicates wide variation in how indigenous peoples and local communities under the Convention indicates wide variation. Wide variation in national level and climate policy making. We have been reviewed the mapping, and the mapping effort involved reviewing and analyzing close to 1,000 documents, including nationally determined contribution, NDC, national adaptation plans, and other submissions, as well as 255 responses to a dedicated survey to map how existing policies, action, and communications under the Convention incorporate the consideration and engagement of indigenous peoples. In relation to these efforts, minimize and address the adverse impacts of climate change, these impacts include risks to the culture, knowledge, and ways of life of indigenous peoples as well as to local knowledge system. The knowledge and transformative approach of indigenous peoples can help guide the global community and in achieving resilience, such as through holistic ecosystem management practices. In relation to barriers and challenges, to means to implementation, the need for multi-directional training and capacity building for sustained engagement, the lack of access to climate funds and language barriers persistent can prevent effective scaling up of mitigation and adaptation efforts needed to achieve the objective of the Paris Agreement. In addition, the adverse impacts of climate change on ecosystem, indigenous cultures, and ways of life can further negatively affect indigenous knowledge systems that are intricately tied to the environment. In relation to good practices and experience and potential opportunities to enhance relevant international cooperation, the work of local communities and indigenous peoples platform itself presents good practices to replicate. An essential aspect in underplanning this role is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This includes the rights related to lands, territories, and resources, and the rights related to indigenous knowledge. Indigenous peoples have made clear their desire and readiness for providing input and being involved in the development of national climate policies and action, including development and implementation of NDC at NAPs. The facility working group is continued to do this important work and is facilitating the exchange of experience and good practices, continue to build capacity for engagement and integrate different ways of knowing to elevate collective progress towards achieving the purpose of the Paris Agreement and its long-term goals. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Adaria. And I think it goes without saying that the FWG is doing a lot of work on this, and that input is valuable for the process as well. And I'm happy that Maria is here now. We're all extremely busy, and we just want to appreciate that you could also be here. I've introduced the panel already and informed the audience that you're chief negotiator for the government of Denmark, and you've also got a colleague here who has been here from the beginning to listen, and we'll come back to you in a little while, Maria. So I think now we should maybe turn away from the global level to the more local level, where real climate action is to take place, and today we'll focus more specifically on Asia and Africa. Lakpa, first over to you. You recently organized an indigenous-led study on the NDCs in 10 Asian countries, and looked into the kind of the level to which level they recognize the rights, roles, and contributions of indigenous peoples. So could you perhaps summarize the main findings and recommendations from this study relevant to the global stocktake? Thanks.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Stefan. I just would like to acknowledge the contributions of Adaria. And as an indigenous peoples engaging in the process, we have really seen the enhancement of the visibility of indigenous peoples' engagement in this process, the establishment of the platform. We saw historical engagement of indigenous peoples in COP27. It's not just the number of indigenous peoples engaging, but in the quality of interventions and also the dedicated events for indigenous peoples, women, youth, and persons with disability has really gone to the next level. And this is something that we need to celebrate together. But for indigenous peoples, having a good agreement on paper, a strong language on human rights on paper is not enough. It's not enough if the policy and promises and the agreement gets implemented in the ground. It doesn't really add value if it just remains on paper. So that's the context why indigenous peoples in Asia decided to stocktake on their own, independently, to see how are those international agreements are actually been put into practice. And we know, like what Graham said, we don't need a stocktake to actually really see what's happening in the ground. It's very evident from our experiences on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, when in our region, many of the states actually adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But if you see how many of them actually recognize indigenous peoples, you can count in fingers. So that's the reality where I come from and the region that I represent. So I know this is not new to you, these publications that we launched in the same room last year, actually. And it was done also with the participation of indigenous women that you can see there in the photos. So we really want to, have that a space for actually knowledge holders to directly contribute to this process. And that is something that the platform is actually trying to enhance. Next. Okay, just briefly on my organizations, it's Asian Indigenous Peoples Pact. Like Stefan said, it's the largest network of indigenous peoples in the region, and we work in 14 countries with 46 members. So we have members in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Mekong, and East Asia. And the nature of our membership ranges from the Federation of Indigenous Peoples, Federation of Indigenous Women, Federation of Indigenous Youth, and also from last General Assembly, we also have a members that represents persons with disability. So that's the diversity of the membership that we have at AIPP. And I'm very happy to say that some of the members of AIPP and partners are inside this room, and they can also contribute in the Q&A. Yes, next. Okay. Just to also say that whatever I'm presenting, it's not just my work. It's a collective work of 19 people from different organizations and different communities that they come from. So you can see the way we set up is like a country team or an author consisting of 1 or 2 people, but then also a regional working group of authors. There are, I think, 4 or 5, 7 people in the regional level. So it's a big group. We really had a challenge because many of the authors got COVID in the process. So it was really a very challenging situation that we passed through. But we're happy what we got after going through all the challenges. Yes, Stefan, next. All right, because I have limited time, so I decided not to put everything what was presented in the last meeting that we had in this room. So I would like to briefly go through some of the key findings that came out and recommendation, and also try to contextualize the process that's going on GST. Okay, like I said, one of the very common thing that indigenous peoples, despite the recognition of indigenous peoples varies from country to country in Asia. But then one thing that's very common, despite the level of recognition of indigenous peoples, is the systematic discriminations, whether it's social, political, economical. So that's very commonly rooted in the context of indigenous peoples in Asia. So directly going to the NDC, as we reviewed the NDCs at the national level with country studies, we found out that with a very few exceptions, indigenous peoples are invisible as rights holders, knowledge holders, and agent of positive change in climate change policies. So that's one of the key findings that came out very clearly. But then what is there? How are we represented? We are represented mostly in the lens of victims. Okay, indigenous peoples are affected, they need help, support. They can be a beneficiary of the project, the policies. So the perspective, the mindset of representing indigenous people's policy is not from a very, how to call that, rights-based approach, right? It's just from the other perspective, which needs to be changed as we engage in this process. And on one of the things, as Graham was mentioning, there are so many problems that's coming to the lands of indigenous peoples, but then also the solutions that are coming are actually creating more pressure, stress, and also challenges for indigenous people. So we are actually facing everything from whatever is happening and discussing at the international level. And when we review the NDC, it doesn't say at all that many of the policies or action plan that is going to be implemented, it will actually happen on the lands of indigenous peoples. So that is silent, completely silent in the policy that came out. So that's one. Because like AIPP works, like I said, with women organizations, youth, and persons with disability, we have our own interest to actually have that focus in the study. And when we reviewed the study, it was only 2 countries in Asia that actually specifically talks about indigenous women and youth. But then if you really see the other countries NDC, they are under the broad category of women and youth. There is no explicit reference to indigenous women and youth. And person with disability, none of the country actually mentions person with disability in their NDC. And again, the portrayal, the images painted in the NDC is like, okay, impact, victimizations and then beneficiaries. So it's very strongly presented that way. And one of the concerns that, and I'm sure this has been and raised in the base report and also IPCC and many of the point that was raised in the previous discussion on loss and damage is also, the NDC is also very much silent on the land tenure of indigenous peoples. And that is at the very heart of the struggle of indigenous peoples, whether it's Asia, Latin America, it's very common. But that's the missing point in the NDC. And I think it's time for Global Stocktake to actually have that perspective and put the customary land tenure in the center of the GST and say to these political recommendations that will come out from COP28 to really put the customary land tenure in the heart of the discussion. And I think this is also the reflection of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, that what is the guiding question of the GST, right? That really determines what would be the outcome, the political outcome. So I think there is a change, there is a need to change in terms of framing the discussions and the language of the guiding questions that's there in the GST. But of course, there are also changes, and many of you, I hope you participated in the World Cafe. I think that's the first time where indigenous peoples were facilitating a dedicated discussion on indigenous peoples. And for us, I think this should not happen just at the international level. The stocktake should happen at the national level, regional level, because if you just see from Asia, I hardly see 5 to 6 people. But I mean, that's not even one country. I mean, in one country, we have so many indigenous community. So I think the stocktake should really happen from the ground so that we can get a very good ambition on rights from the governments, right? So I think that's something that needs to change. And for us, it's very clear, if government don't do it, we will take lead in terms of, because we represent the communities, right? So I think we don't wait for the government, and that's also one of the example of this study, that we want to stock take and not just wait for government to have these rights ambitions reflected. Just flag me if I'm taking long. Just to also show the opportunities, of course, there are also opportunities, not like, there is no space for indigenous peoples to engage at all. And like I said, platform is one example. And I think as indigenous people started engaging in this process, because climate change was seen more as technical in the past. Like even when I used to work a lot in the field to give trainings and consultation, there is no term climate change in many of the indigenous languages, right? So it's hard to discuss and relate with indigenous communities. But from my experiences, there are also opportunities that is coming out because of what has happened at the international level. So there are some examples where indigenous peoples have set up their own partnership on climate change. Just to give an example on REDD+, for example, so there is some engagement at the national level. But then with that opportunity, there is also challenges within the opportunity. For example, when there is a working group, for example, set up at the national level, there is one indigenous peoples and let's say 9 or 10 government. And when we talk about FPIC strongly or land tenure, just imagine the response that you would get and the difficulty that you will face to actually put that in the decision making, right? So it's a practical challenge that indigenous peoples are facing in the ground. And one thing that came out very strongly from our studies was that we should not just paint this victim. And sometimes we might do it unknowingly, right? And it's also like we need to become more conscious and sensitize ourselves in our advocacy work, that to provide an evidence that we are not being affected, but actually we are contributing to the implementation of Paris Agreement. And we actually collected a number of case studies, but then there was a limitation of how long we want, right? People will not read like 200 pages of the report. So what we did is we started coming out with mapping out the key strong stories and put it in the form of a photo story. So this is the photo story that we did showing the leadership of indigenous indigenous women from northern Thailand. And this was done, of course, the leadership of the whole process was undertaken by the women themselves and not, we're just a facilitator. So when we went there, before I came to Bonn, actually our team was in the field to actually give back this to the community, because it has to be something useful for them and not useful just for our advocacy work. And I think that's not the spirit of our working with the communities, because eventually whatever we do has to benefit to the communities. And we got a very good feedback from the communities, and they were saying that there was a meeting where the guests came to the community, but the community were busy looking at the photos. So it somehow affected the meeting, So we have received very good feedback so far, and we'll be, because for us on climate and biodiversity is central of indigenous women's participation. So we'll be launching another publications on food system, but we'll launch that from the communities. Don't launch from a hotel or AIPP office, but we'll really go to the ground and have them be the one to launch their story. So that's the kind of shift that we are trying to do from our work. Sorry, coming back to the recommendations. I think, like I said, tenure should be very much central at the discussion of the GST. And full and equitable participation. I think equity has to be there. So it's not like one or two, but then there has to be an equitable representation of indigenous peoples, women, youth, and persons with disability. And also one thing that we have raised in the platform discussion as well, and Adaria knows it very clearly, that we should not just limit this platform at the international level. Of course, our participation is needed, our visibility is important. We need to network with the government, we need to talk to them, we'll see the potential of partnership that we can bring it to our region. But if we don't have specific or dedicated space at the national level, I think we might take a lot of time actually to achieve the objective of the platform itself, because the objective is really to strengthen. And just participating at regional and international may not be enough to actually really help strengthen the knowledge system. So I think there is a need to also slowly, gradually shift that platform to the national and also to the local level, so that I think this came out very clearly also in one of the meetings that I attended. Language barrier is key in the UNFCCC, because maybe some of us can speak, but imagine the knowledge holders who are actually the solutions to the problems that we have. And when it comes to the textual proposal and negotiations, where are the roles that they have, right? Language. there is no translation for indigenous languages, and I think even our sisters from Brazil, they have to bring their own translator in this process. So that's the kind of practical challenges that indigenous peoples face, and that needs to be improved. And just a final point, because there are so many, I'm just trying to, yeah, I think maybe one of the things that we need to, as indigenous peoples and also support groups for indigenous peoples, is to really think as we transition from political phase of the GST to the, technical phase of the GST to the political phase of the Global Stocktake, how can we enhance this little space that we got in the World Cafe yesterday to have a dedicated leaders of indigenous peoples facilitating? I think we need to have more indigenous peoples in that process and really have a say in what comes out of the political outcome of GST. Otherwise, then we know the political will towards framing the rights ambition on the rights of indigenous peoples might not be enough. And I think it's not just indigenous peoples, it's everyone in the room, the government, the support groups, the civil society has a role to play to further amplify the issues that we're raising here. So I'll just stop there. Sorry for taking long. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lakba. I know you have a lot to say, and I mean, Asia is also the region, like 70% of the world's indigenous peoples, I believe, live in Asia, and you have a lot to say. And I think the work that AIPP does at regional level exemplifies very well what should be done with everything we do in terms of you are a regional organization, but you really do manage to do work on the ground through your partners and members in a local level. And thanks so much for bringing up many good points, especially around very concrete, customary land tenure and other issues for the global stocktake. Thanks for that. Quickly, let me turn towards you, Gideon. So COP27 last year took place in Africa. It would be good if we could hear from your region as well. If you could share some of the perspectives from indigenous peoples there that have relevance to the global stocktake, and maybe also if you could talk a bit about the impact of what some have called false solutions, which is coined as climate action, but maybe have other motives behind, and what impact that has for indigenous peoples there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan, and I also appreciate for organizing this important side events, IGIA together with IGIA's partners. COP27 was held last year in Africa, and among the key major decisions from that COP, one of it was the establishment or the creation of the loss and damage funding mechanism. But the funding has not yet have resources. It is an empty basket yet. But we are really looking forward to see how does this funding mechanism will address the losses and damages with regards to indigenous people around land and territories. And how does the funding, this funding loss and damage funding mechanism will also try to address non-economical losses, our values, our knowledge. How does this funding mechanism modalities will address and take into account the loss that have already occurred in our land and territories. So we are all wondering and excited to see when the funding will kick off, how will it address the right of indigenous people? How will it, claim back what we have already lost? Indeed, Africa is a temperature hotspot region. And indeed, it is a vulnerable, one of the vulnerable countries in the world affected by the impact of climate change. So COP27 tried to bring some of the indigenous people representatives to push for the best decisions that will take into account and address the challenges that are affecting indigenous people from their land. With regards to global stocktakes, it aims to assess the progress that have made to achieve the goal and targets of the Paris Agreement. The IPCC reports Working Group 2 on adaptation and vulnerability, but also IPCC reports Working Group 3 on mitigations, both calls for the global actions to address the impacts of climate change to vulnerable communities as far as indigenous people are concerned. The temperature rise currently is at 1.1 as we speak, but the Paris agreements call to limit the temperature global warming rise to 1.5 degrees. But to what extent the both developed and developing countries are taking action to address the global warming? That we as indigenous people, we are in the front lines of these major impacts. Now, when it comes to indigenous people and climate actions at our local level, climate change interventions tends to be a burden and a bitter and also posed major threats to indigenous people rights over their land and resource use. And I give an example from my own country or my own region, Africa, where the land of indigenous people were taken, people were forcefully evicted and forcefully evicted from their ancestral land in the name of forest conservation. So people, for example, in northern Tanzania, the famous Ngorongoro and Loliondo, most of them were evicted from their ancestral land for conservations. And there is a reason behind, not even conservation. Indeed, it is a trophy hunting from investors. But also there are other community forests. They conserve the forest over the time. And now people were evicted to give the investment on carbon trading. So when you look at this climate intervention to address the carbon sink, the climate issues, it also goes in line with forcing people get away from their ancestral land. So to what extent the global stocktake will take into considerations the current major challenges that facing indigenous people from their ancestral land, claiming that they are addressing climate change, but in fact, they are removing people from their ancestral land. When it comes to NDCs, for example, the NDCs of Tanzania, for example, you cannot find references to indigenous people. They are just saying, livestock, but only is it, when you mention livestock, are you really addressing indigenous people rights? So as we talk about the GST, there is a need really to ensure that countries who are going to review the NDCs should really make sure that indigenous people are part and parcel of the NDCs developments to formulate issues that take their issues and right into considerations. Yeah, let me stop from here.
Thank you so much. And I think you gave some very good examples, really very concrete examples of how in the name of climate action or nature conservation, a lot can be done, and also with other motives that can harm indigenous peoples. and so I think, I mean, we might come back to that later, but time is running, and so Graham, I have to ask you to be extremely brief now, because you participated in co-authoring this global mapping of the NDCs, and looked into to what degree the NDCs recognize indigenous peoples in climate governance, and that has also been made a submission to the Global Stocktake here. But again, very briefly, I know it's all the NDCs in the world that has ever been submitted, but could you summarize in a couple of minutes, please?
Yeah, I'll be really brief, and as was indicated, this document is up on IWGIA's website, and so if you're looking for the full document and the recognition of Indigenous peoples within NDCs, please go to the website and you can look at it in much more detail. In that analysis, we looked at kind of 5 major categories that I think were summarized here quite clearly. The upholding and protection of Indigenous rights, the kind of full inclusion of Indigenous peoples as jurisdictions, and those rights as affirmed in the UN Declaration, the importance of engaging with ethical and equitable knowledge systems, or engaging ethically and equitably with Indigenous knowledge systems, the importance of direct engagement, both with respect to finance, but also with respect to the process itself. And then really we looked at this element of colonization, like how are we embedding that context within the broader context of Indigenous peoples. And here on this map, you see the total number of countries that have made references to Indigenous peoples within the 2 rounds of assessments, or within the 2 rounds of submissions, sorry. And you see here that there are parties that have made 2 submissions, only some of which that have made references to Indigenous peoples in both areas. And in the document itself, you see at the bottom there on the screen, there's a specific annex that talks about like all of the different countries and their references to these 5 categories. And as Gideon shared, in Tanzania, unfortunately, there are none. There are only, I think, 4 countries in total that acknowledged all 5 of those categories. And so when thinking about the relevancy of these exercises to the global stocktake, I think there are multiple avenues that we could consider in our discussions. The first, and I think was shared by all 3 of my co-panelists, is the NDCs as a mechanism of parties' communications of their climate action are doing really poorly in how they engage with Indigenous peoples, with Indigenous rights, with Indigenous knowledge systems. And so, through the stocktake and through the work of the facilitative working group, as well as the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, there are opportunities to further provide guidance to countries as they contemplate how they're communicating the solutions of Indigenous peoples, how they're engaging with Indigenous peoples, and how also the proposed efforts aren't undermining their rights. And so I just conclude, because I know we're a little bit tight, is there's also, I think, an equal opportunity that the Indigenous Caucus has been expressing for a while, which is like in the absence of state recognition and inclusion within their nationally determined contributions, what are the mechanisms for Indigenous peoples to communicate that into the process, to communicate that based on their solutions on the ground? And we have an elder who used to attend regularly, Elder Frank AIWGIA, who really talked about what would indigenously determined contributions look like, and what are the ways in which those indigenously determined contributions conceptualize and operationalize the ways in which Indigenous peoples think about and act on climate. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that opportunity presented. But again, more details, obviously, within the document itself. As we progress through the various rounds of submissions, we'll be able to really track over time how the advocacy of Indigenous peoples in the global and local level have been contributing to the communication and incorporation of them within these nationally determined contributions. And then to Daria's point, the role of mechanisms like the facilitative working group to provide additional guidance for the conduct of that in a equitable and ethical way. So miigwech.
Thank you so much. Now, there's been a lot shared and a lot of concrete recommendations, but I think now it's time to maybe turn towards you, Maria. So the question is obviously, do governments, or to what level, to what degree governments share these perspectives of the indigenous peoples, and if there is an understanding of those amongst the various government delegations, and we invited you today because we know that Denmark is quite friendly towards some of these issues, which we appreciate, and I also recognize that your colleague Frode was here at the previous side event on loss and damage organized by indigenous peoples. But sorry, one thing I need to mention, we didn't mention Rosario Carmona, who is here in the room, and she co-authored, she was she's doing everything, and that's amazing. But she also played the minor role of leading the study that Graham presented before, and we're very grateful for her support. But sorry, coming back to you, Maria. So I guess my question to you is, if I could ask you to reflect on these recommendations we've heard today, and if you see that your government will be able to push some of these recommendations, maybe within the EU and other groupings that you engage in during these negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan, and thank you so much for inviting me to this event, which I think is so valuable and in this critical time. And sorry for being late, everyone, but I'm really happy to be here. And I think I want to start a bit at a different level, and then I'll go into the recommendations later on, because I think, for Denmark, the Global Stocktake is such a decisive moment. It's not just looking at how far we are in our global efforts to achieve the goals in the Paris Agreement that we've set ourselves, but it's also a chance to look at how we work and how we implement. And there's no doubt for us that if we want to reach the goal goals we've set ourselves, we need to ensure an inclusive process, and we need to make sure that builds on also the experience and the knowledge of indigenous people. I think that's key. I read recently that 80% of global biodiversity is protected by indigenous people. And if that point doesn't really underline that fact, then I don't know what will. So for us, that's so important. And I think, as Stefan says, from the Danish side, we have a long history of supporting initiatives that both protect human rights, both in the UN and through partnerships, and also working with indigenous peoples and with partnerships that focus on indigenous people, and we're going to continue doing that. But I think bringing it into this space and making sure that this is a conversation we keep on having will be absolutely key. So in that light, I think the recommendations that you've presented today, both here at the side event, but also reading through the publications, are amazing inputs to the Global Stocktake that we're having right now. And I think, it can help qualify our work. It can help strengthen our work. And I think it should be a key input also in the political phase going forward, and not just in the technical part, because the Global Stocktake will also be about the credible answers that we deliver to the gaps that we identified. So I think that will be very important. I think when we look at gaps, it's not just gaps in ambition and implementation, but it can also be knowledge gaps. I mean, where do we need more info, more experience? And I think that's also an area in which these recommendations also provide a very valuable input. I'm not going to go into all the recommendations. I just think some of the thinking about the NDCs and how we can strengthen our work with the NDCs is very important and really interesting thoughts. And I think we would definitely be looking into how we can perhaps bring that into the discussions where we engage, obviously through the EU, and obviously I can't speak for all governments in this capacity, but just to reassure you that it's definitely something that we have a lot of focus on. And then I guess just, I mean, the last point is that now we talk about this in the context of the Global Stocktake, and it's a great opportunity, but I think, I mean, just to reassure that this is not just a Global Stocktake issue. This is a long-term issue, and I think we should keep on maintaining this focus. But I recognize that this is the kind of the political focus right now. But just to keep that point going forward. So just a few reflections from my side.
Thank you so much, Maria. And maybe if I may, just a brief follow-up questions, because many of our other panelists and many people in the room here are actively engaged in the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, and would maybe like to hear, including myself, like maybe if you have some good advice on how to influence now this political process we're going to have at COP28. What would your recommendations to us be in that regard?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, I mean, using every opportunity that is there. We're going to have a lot of political meetings through the fall, and I think using those channels, using those hooks to raise this issue will be very important. But I think, I mean, it's also a question of finding your alliances, right? And finding out who will be partnering with you in bringing this up. And I think, I mean, that's also obviously work that takes time, and you need to engage. And I think using opportunities like this is key. Yeah, engaging everything you can and bringing this also bringing this knowledge forward, I think is just a key, because not everyone is very well aware.
Thank you so much, Maria. One more round of applause. And because we only have 10 minutes left, I'd love to have a second round of reflection from the panel, but I do really want to give time to questions, and so and maybe then in responding to the questions, you can also kind of reflect on other things that has been said. So any questions out there? Yes, we have. Well, we have many. Joseph first, and the one in the back, and then here. Let's take 3 questions first.
Well, thank you, the panelists, and thank you, the facilitator. The stock taking coming at the right time, and I think it might shape the whole concept and structure of loss and damage fund. I imagine the loss and damage fund might look from or approach issue from a human rights angle than the current structure of climate governance. My question, or I think it's a question, picking from what Gideon had just said. I think I look at Africa from 2 angles. One, during the colonization period, and currently the climate intervention phase. And indigenous people are becoming victims, really, of this intervention. Intervention are coming from 2 angles. One, from what they call loans, and the second, what they call trade and investments. And I think we have become victims of these 2. My challenge is, I think the countries that have been pro-human rights before, seem to have moved slowly toward trade and investments, and they have lost the commitment of promoting human rights. And in the area of what they called clean energy, clean energy transition and all this, this has been today the mechanism for land grabbing in indigenous people territories. And I think talking about extractive industry, all this. And my question to the delegation of Denmark, where I've been, a traditional human rights supporter for many years, how could you influence or assist indigenous peoples so that European Union and European Parliament, European Commission could start going back to traditional looking issues from a human rights perspective, because we are becoming victims of your resources in terms of trade and investments and loans in the name of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that was a really good and concrete question there. But let's take the next one down in the back there. I do. It's Kimmer. Yes.
Thank you very much for the very insightful contribution from the panelists. My comment is around NDCs is a journey to somewhere. And the Global Stocktake is a moment in that journey. The ultimate home is carbon credits. So the countries are ultimately going to use these NDCs in the voluntary or compliance market. And the experience we have in Kenya is that the carbon cowboys are in the landscape, and they are way ahead of communities. And they are layering the struggle for security of land rights with carbon property claims and trading. And the tragedy is carbon is an abstract property, which people can trade when the tree is still standing. And so the question is, how do we pick up this discussion? Because the foundational place of displacement is NDCs. And the realization of this displacement is in the carbon market credits. So my general question is, how do we see this study feeding into preparing communities to say no or whatever direction they want to go on carbon? Because that is the ultimate, and it's happening even as we do stocktake. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, unfortunately, we'll just have to stick to these two questions just to give time, and we also want a brief wrap up. So maybe, Maria, the first question was directed to you, and if you have anything to add to the second question, please do so.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the question and for the consideration, really, because I think it's getting that perspective is very valuable in getting your inputs to it. I think, I mean, what I want to say is that, at least in our perspective, these two, the efforts that we're making and taking into account the local communities is each other's condition. I mean, we have to do both at the same time to make sure that we get to where we want to go. And I think, I mean, using our voice within the EU and within the groups that we engage with, we're going to continue to do that. Obviously, we're trying to influence others, and we hope we're effectful of that. But just to assure you that that's a focus that we very much have, because we can't do one without the other. So I think that was my quick reaction.
Thanks so much, Maria. To the other panelists, any comments or responses to either Kimaran or Joseph?
I can respond to Kimaran. I think that's a very important point, Kimaran, that you have raised. One thing that I have to accept, that we did not explicitly look into the details of the language that's there on carbon market, particularly for this study, but I actually had a rapid view of the updated NDC, And I can see that there's a lot of reference, low carbon economy, market-based economy. So there is, like you said, the trend that a lot of things that you have just explained is coming to the communities. So what can we do? Of course, the first thing is to engage in this process where these things are being discussed at the international level and making sure that human rights-based approach is strongly embedded in all this discussion. And we know the challenges that indigenous peoples are facing in this discussion, Article 6, where there was not at all a participation, like they had to look from another room, what is the discussion going on, right? So there's just challenges that we are facing. And even more challenges is really what if, like you said, they are already advancing even before we actually aware the community about this process. So one of the things that at AIPP, when this REDD+ discussion came in, and I think it relates to the carbon market as well, because there were different positions of indigenous peoples as well, and we know it very well, whether we engage in the REDD+ or we completely get out of the process. But then in our region, we had a collective discussions, and we came to a conclusion that we take our stand that we have to engage, and also we make sure that we are adding more pressure to the government to make sure that the measures, response measures that I think we are all discussing actually will not further create loss and damage within the communities. And that's not, I'm just talking about the impacts of climate change, but then also the eviction, like what our brother have said. So I think from our end at AIPP, we have started creating community-friendly educational materials. Like, for example, what would be the process for communities to actually interact with these people when they come to the community. And we have a very good animation video on FPIC, translated into many languages in Asia, and we have received a feedback that even conservation organizations are actually using this animation video to help sensitize their staff actually to how do we approach the community at the local level. And I think one of another approach that we did in our region is also really produce resource person about this, because I don't think it would be enough just to have a meeting like this. We need really a dedicated discussions, trainings, and workshop. We need to produce more people who can really fully understand this and can go to the community and really have that sharing of information, and really also map out where are these map out where are these actors coming in, right? We can really, because one of the example that we recently had, I think it was last year in our region, was that there was a deal that a government had for 100 years, which is called a nature deal, and communities doesn't know anything about it, and it's again relates to the market that we are all discussing here. So I think while we are trying to pressure the government to actually make sure that they consult with us, they make sure that we are adequately represented, but also I think it's up to us to be more responsible, being the representative organizations of indigenous peoples, take those information, simplify and share, because I think if we don't do it, then who will do for the communities? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Graham?
Yeah, I just want to add, I think the point that both Cameron and Joseph raised is broader than just the NDCs and the GHG. I think it's really, what I was trying to articulate earlier is, it's based on a misunderstanding of what the climate problem is. And so when we hear about that example of carbon credits, we don't really acknowledge the role of technology in markets and causing the problems that we're aspiring to solve. And so, I think we really need to conceptualize technology and markets as coinciding with the reassertion of power and authority of indigenous peoples as captured, through those minimum standards contained within the UN Declaration.
Thank you so much to all of you today. We are out of time. I just want to quickly wrap up some points. I mean, we have talked about the importance of safeguarding indigenous people's rights in the global stocktake. We have talked about the risk to indigenous people's rights, not only for the effects of impacts from climate change, but also indeed the impacts of climate action. We've also talked about recognizing indigenous leadership in realizing how to address the climate crisis in a way that deals with the root causes and not replicating the colonial past. And I think with that, I think I'm gonna we have to finish up now. I'm gonna thank you, the panel. Thanks to all of you and to all of you who have been out here. Thank you so much to our interpreters who are following us here these 2 weeks, and they are doing a tireless job. It's amazing. So, and thanks to all the organizers. Thank you.